Goals for today, our objectives up here on the board. By the end of class today, you should be able to balance a simple equation, so we'll talk about what that means. And you should be able to explain the difference between short-term and long-term carbon cycling. So we're going to talk about the carbon cycle and how there are parts of that cycle that are short-term and parts that are long-term. We've talked a little bit about the carbon cycle before. We're going to get into more depth. And then we're going to be able to describe how plants and animals use the products of photosynthesis and respiration. So what are those processes? How do plants and animals go through them? And then how do they use those products from those reactions? Okay? So we're going to start with balancing equations. Okay? When we write out chemical equations using the formulas for each molecule that's involved in the equation has to be what we call balanced. Okay? This means that on both sides of the equation, both what you start with and what you end with, there must be the same number of each type of atom on both sides of the equation. The reason for this is because of something that we call the law of conservation of matter. The law of conservation of matter just says that you can't create new matter and you can't destroy old matter. It can only change from one form to another. So when you have a chemical reaction happen, what's happening is you're not destroying an old thing and creating a new thing, but instead you're taking apart that old thing into its smallest pieces and combining those pieces in a different form and making a new substance. We practiced this a little bit yesterday when we had the model kits out. You can take apart pieces of molecules into their atoms and then rearrange those atoms into a new substance. So let's look at an example of this, okay? This is the equation for photosynthesis. It's the one that we used in our lab yesterday. However, this equation is incorrect because it is not balanced. I want you to take a look at the left side of the equation, so before you get to the arrow, okay? How many carbon atoms are on the left side of this equation? And to do that, just count how many letter C's. On the left side of the arrow, how many C's are there? One on the left side of the arrow, right? But Alex was looking on the right side. How many are on the right side? 6. Yeah. So if this was true, we'd need to find 6 carbon atoms, or at least 5 carbon atoms, that came from nowhere. Okay? It would mean we had created 6 carbon atoms, which we cannot do. Okay? I also want you to notice that on the left side of this, there are only 3 oxygen atoms, and on the right side we have 8, and on the left side we only have 2 hydrogen atoms, but on the right side we have 12. So all in all, we're starting with fewer pieces than we end up with in our product, and that won't work. So instead, what happens is we have to balance the equation. So this is what the equation looks like when it's balanced. Okay? Notice how this time, instead of just being little numbers, there are big numbers as well, right? So if you have a big number in front of the equation, that's the same as saying you have that many of that molecule. So notice how it says 6 CO2? That means that we have 6 molecules of CO2. So we would wind up with, we could write it out, instead of writing 6 CO2, we could write CO2 6 times. So you'd wind up with 6 carbon and 12 oxygen, because 6 times 2 is 12. And then we have 6 molecules of water this time. So now we have 12 hydrogen atoms and 6 more oxygen atoms. So if we're adding this up in total, on this side of the equation, we have 6 carbon atoms, 12 oxygen atoms, well, not 12, 18, because you add the 6 or the 12 from here and the 6 from here. So we have 18 oxygen atoms, and then we have 12 hydrogen atoms. Okay? So if we look on the other side of the equation, we have 6 carbon atoms. So you can see the C6 means 6 carbon atoms. We have 12 hydrogen atoms. And then if you add the 6 from this molecule to the 12 from this molecule, you'll get 18 oxygen atoms. So now it's balanced. So by balanced, we mean starting and ending with the same amounts of each individual atom when you add them all up. There are no new ones made, and there are no leftovers. But you'll notice that it takes multiple molecules of carbon dioxide and multiple molecules of water to make just one molecule of glucose, and then those leftover or extra oxygen atoms that aren't used don't just disappear. This is the reason why photosynthesis not only produces sugar, but also produces oxygen as a gas that then the plants release into the atmosphere and we are able to breathe. So it doesn't disappear, it changes form. It's not carbon dioxide and water anymore. Now it's glucose, which is a simple sugar, and oxygen that we breathe. To me, it feels like a magic trick that plants are able to do. But there is a process that you are also able to do that is essentially the opposite of this process, where you're able to take glucose and oxygen and turn them into carbon dioxide and water. Now, let's talk about recycling materials. We know from chapter 6, because we talked about this a little bit already, that there's a finite amount of materials on Earth, which means those materials have to be recycled. Before a chemical reaction can take place, we have to find the raw materials or the reactants for that reaction to take place. And if those reactants aren't there, then the reaction can't move forward. The reactants for photosynthesis are carbon dioxide and water. Plants are able to get these materials from the air and then also from water. So they suck up water through their roots, and then there's a gas exchange that happens in the leaves of plants, okay, where they release oxygen and take in carbon dioxide. Then plants are able to use those materials to make glucose, which can be used for energy or sometimes as a base for more complex carbohydrates. Because remember, glucose is the base molecule of a carbohydrate. So plants sometimes use that glucose and they break it down for energy, and sometimes plants take that glucose and make it into complex carbohydrates. They can make it into carbohydrates that store energy for them, or they can make it into cellulose. Cellulose is a complex carbohydrate that has a very strong, sturdy structure, and that structure is what allows plants to have stability. So they use this for lots of different things. The reactants for respiration are glucose and oxygen. So I want you to notice something there. What photosynthesis makes, glucose and oxygen, respiration requires. Okay? So then animals are able to get those materials from the air, because plants release oxygen into the atmosphere, and from their food, which is usually a plant or an animal that has eaten a plant and made its own structures from the same glucose produced by those plants. Then they use those materials to get energy, and they produce waste products of carbon dioxide and water, which can be used by photosynthesis. So these two, respiration and photosynthesis, form a nice big circle. what respiration produces, photosynthesis uses. What photosynthesis produces, respiration uses. So that is the answer to our bell ringer. That's the connection between the products of respiration and the reactants, or the raw materials of photosynthesis. The last little piece we need to talk about today is the carbon cycle. Okay? There's not a lot to write about the carbon cycle because I've included a nice image of it for you. Okay? And what I want you to note on this carbon cycle is I want you to notice how there are short-term and long-term portions of the carbon cycle. Just take a look at this image, okay? So at the very top, we have carbon dioxide that's in the atmosphere. It can be in the form of carbon dioxide, or it can be in the form of methane, which is CH4, or it can be in the form of carbon monoxide, CO. There's lots of different forms of carbon that are in our atmosphere all the time. So what happens is then that carbon can get taken in through photosynthesis and put into food chains here on Earth. So that would be a relatively short process. Now, it may not feel super short to you, but it doesn't take super long for that carbon to get recycled back into our atmosphere, because in the grand scheme of things, plants and animals don't live super long. We go through respiration every day, so we're constantly breaking down glucose and putting it back out into the atmosphere. Okay? However, there are some more long-term processes. So you'll notice that aquatic food chains can take in carbon, and then that can go right back out through respiration and decomposition, okay? But what can also happen then is that plants and animals and aquatic things can die, and they can sink to the bottom of the ocean and get covered by layers of sediment, and over a extremely long period of time, they can get turned into fossil fuels like oil, natural gas, coal. That's a really long process. That carbon is stuck for a long time before it gets back out into our atmosphere, because what has to happen is this long process has to take forever to turn the carbon into a fossil fuel, and then we have to dig up the fossil fuel, and then we have to burn the fossil fuel, and then finally through that process, then the fossil fuel, the carbon can get released back into the atmosphere. So that's a much more long-term process than just becoming glucose in a plant and then getting broken down and exhaled as carbon dioxide. It takes a much longer period of time. So there are some short-term processes in the carbon cycle and some long-term processes in the carbon cycle.